Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Caughey. I'm in my final semester at NYU Steinhardt's Master's in Mental Health Counseling program. And last year, I had the pleasure of attending the Somatic Trauma Healing Institute, which was hosted by the Embody Lab and featured some of the pioneers in the somatic movement, including Gabor Mate, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and Peter Levine. I also had the opportunity to attend some of the presentations of Cheng Thom, who prior to this moment I had not been exposed to, but I think offers a really kind of inspiring and beautiful framework for integrating the somatics into her pursuit of social justice and collective liberation. So I wanted to take today's presentation as an opportunity to share a little bit more about her work and hopefully expose some of her content to others that might not be familiar and that might be interested in learning more. So I will begin just with an introduction to Cheng Thom. My presentation titled Befriending the Body is based on her content, so I want to do a little definition around that. I will talk about some of the core frameworks of the work. We will dive into some practical applications of how to bring in somatic work into your work with clients. We will talk a bit about personal and collective healing. And in closing, I will also offer up some additional resources for those that might want to dive a bit deeper. So first and foremost, Cheng Thom is a trans, queer, Chinese-Canadian writer, performer, psychotherapist, and healer. Her work spans activism, mental health, poetry, and storytelling, blending personal and political healing. Some of her work includes I Hope We Choose Love, Fierce Femmes, and Notorious Liars, Falling Back in Love with Being Human, amongst others. And her approach offers an intersectional model for looking at self-love, body liberation, and transformative justice. So first and foremost, what does it mean to befriend the body? The concept of befriending the body is rooted in Kai's work as a psychotherapist and a healer. Many of us, especially those in this field, recognize that we inherit trauma, shame, and disconnection from our bodies due to oppression, gender norms, beauty standards, and our own personal lived experiences. So, befriending the body in this case means shifting from a position of self criticism to one of self acceptance, ideally finding joy in embodiment and using pleasure as a tool for healing. Kai really stresses that this work is not just on the individual level, it is both political and it is collective. It's deeply connected to movements for justice, liberation, and radical self love. Some of the core frameworks that I would like to explore here, obviously not everything that is rooted in her work, but the politics of healing, the politics of the body. So, thinking about how trauma, oppression, and social conditioning impact our access to embodiment. Somatic awareness and body based practices. So, recognizing the body's relationship to memory, trauma, and wisdom. And finally, pleasure activism and radical self love, being able to reclaim pleasure as an act of resistance. So, starting with the politics of the body and healing, Kai recognizes that healing is not just personal, it's tied to power, oppression, and collective care. So, the hope is that we learn to see our bodies as sites of struggle due to racism, fat phobia, ableism, transphobia, and systemic violence, really being able to zoom out from that micro into the macro context and understand the systems in which we exist and that shape us. Kai encourages us to recognize that healing is a political act. Choosing to love ourselves in a world that tells us otherwise is in and of itself a form of resistance. Her work challenges traditional therapeutic models that focus more on individual healing without necessarily considering the social, cultural, and systemic factors that shape a person's pain and their suffering and inevitably will inform their healing process. Moving into somatic awareness and body-based practices, Bessel van der Kolk really popularized this work through his book, The Body Keeps the Score, but recognizing that the body holds memory, trauma, and wisdom. So healing cannot be done on an intellectual or cognitive level only. It must be embodied. So this is where somatic comes in. It is the practice of listening to and working with the body's signals, sensations, and its needs. Some ways to cultivate somatic awareness, which I'll dive into a bit more in depth later, one being body scans. So practicing a body scan to recognize where tension, numbness, tightness, or even ease exists. Noticing emotions, so even just dropping in and recognizing how different emotions present and manifest in the body, and building a greater dexterity or a library for understanding what those are. And finally, intuitive movement, so allowing the body to move intuitively and freely rather than being stuck in rigidity or control. Moving into pleasure activism and radical self-love. This was a concept that was really popularized by Adrienne Maree Brown, which I'll discuss more in the next few slides. Many of us are taught very early on that pleasure is indulgent, sinful, or selfish. So reclaiming pleasure in this space is all about allowing joy, softness, and delight. It's about finding pleasure in the everyday sensory experiences, and it's about recognizing that pleasure can be a political tool to restore, fuel resistance, and enable survival. Radical self-love here is not about perfection or fixing oneself. It's about embracing the wholeness of who we are. And that usually means integrating some of our shadows, our trauma, and our complexity in the process. Adrienne Maree Brown has a book called Pleasure Activism, which really informed Kai's beliefs around this. And they both encourage us to view pleasure as a healing force. A quote that I loved from Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, that I would love to share. I believe our imaginations, particularly the parts of our imaginations that hold what we most desire, what brings us pleasure, what makes us scream yes, are where we must seed the future, turn towards justice and liberation, and reprogram ourselves to desire sexually and erotically empowered lives. Now to shift into some practical applications for befriending the body. Somatic practices, self-love practices, and relational healing are all core modalities that Kai expresses in her work. And so just to dive a bit deeper into some of the somatic ones, a body scan, as we discussed earlier, is a mindful meditative practice that involves focusing our attention on the sensations in different parts of the body, cultivating deeper body awareness, reducing stress, and improving our overall well-being. Can be a really nice way to start a session with clients because it sort of invites them to really drop in and be present with the current moment, and ideally in a way that feels really safe and trusting for them. Movement is another modality, so intuitively dancing, shaking, or stretching to reduce stored tension. Breath work is a core part of somatic work, so obviously lots of different forms of this, but deep belly breathing being a wonderful way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which can really be a signal to our mind, body, our nervous system that we are safe in this moment. So oftentimes with clients, I'll encourage an inhale to the count of 4 with a pause and an exhale to the count of 6. So anytime our exhale is longer than our inhale, it's a signal to our systems that there's safety here. And so that's something I do every session. Vocalization is using things like humming, sighing, or vocalizing to release some of that stored tension. And finally, affirmation. So using positive statements that can help people develop body neutrality and greater sort of self-awareness. So that shifts us nicely into the self-love practices. So some interventions that could be used would be writing a love letter, so addressing your body with kindness instead of criticism. Ideally deprogramming and unlearning some of the ways that society teaches us or media teaches us to talk to ourselves. Mirror work refers to looking at ourselves in the mirror with gentleness and offering some of those positive affirmations. And then finally, this idea of a pleasure ritual. So in an everyday, day-to-day practice, integrating sort of this mindfulness pleasurable ritual into how we eat or how we create art or how we listen to music or even how we rest. And I really love the work of Tricia Hersey, who talks a lot about the politics of rest, this idea that many of the marginalized and oppressed communities have been denied the right to rest, and that's been reinforced by capitalism and white supremacy. So just really recognizing where we can invite in pleasure through all of these different day-to-day practices. And finally, as Kai talks a lot about in all of her work, she believes in this idea of communal and collective healing. So how do we bring the relational into the healing process? That can be done doing anything from consensual touch, massaging, cuddling, hugging trusted friends, witnessing, really just holding space and safe containers for all, for people to really experience their emotions in a place where they can be witnessed by others, and then really just creating more spaces for collective healing. So places where people can be vulnerable together without shame. So, healing is not just about individual self care, it is about transforming systems and communities. So, again, that shift from just the micro to the macro and consciously thinking about how we bring the individual into the collective. So, this is all about bridging personal and collective healing. Caughey's work challenges some of the dominant paradigms and narratives around beauty and desirability. Who gets to be seen as lovable or worthy? She challenges productivity culture. How much of our worth is tied to how much we create, we produce? And finally, this cultural narrative: who is allowed to experience pleasure, rest, and joy, and who is not? So, in all of her work, the role of storytelling, poetry, and creative expression is so important. So, using storytelling to reclaim power, process pain, and imagine new possibilities and futures, and really leveraging writing, art, and movement as tools for liberation in the process. So, I wanted to wind down by just offering up a few reflection questions to consider as we kind of bring it all back to the work that we do. First and foremost, like, how do you relate to your body today? And as you start to think about that and we start to explore that, it's worth noting and interrogating what are the messages that you've received about your body? What messages have come from family? What messages come from friends? What messages come from society? What does media tell us about our bodies? So, in order to interrogate and unlearn and unpack a lot of that, just really being conscious where those messages are coming from. And as we think about how to bring these practices back to ourselves, back to our clients, what is one small way that you can practice befriending your body this week? Is it a body scan? Is it a breathwork exercise? Is there a way that you can invite in a group of trusted friends and integrate touch and integrate witnessing of each other's emotions? I love this idea of a pleasure ritual. How does that come up in the day to day, whether it's with eating or with resting or with the way that we practice mindfulness and meditation? So just integrating pleasure throughout our day. And finally, how can we integrate pleasure into collective healing? So as Kai talks a lot about, zooming out again and into how we think about pleasure can be a pathway for collective healing and social justice. So, what are some ways that you may want to integrate that into your work with clients? My hope is that this presentation was an invitation to rethink our relationship with our bodies, not as objects to be fixed, but as sources of wisdom, pleasure, and liberation. Cheng Thom's work reminds us that healing is not about being perfect. It's about reclaiming joy, softness, and connection in a world that tries to take those things away. Thank you all for tuning in and listening to my presentation. Appreciate it if you've made it this far. I did want to leave you with a few resources as we wrap up. But some of the books that I had mentioned earlier by Cheng Thom: I Hope We Choose Love, Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, which is available on audio and I'm listening right now, Falling Back in Love with Being Human. Some related works, we talked a bit about Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown, The Body Is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, which I loved, and also Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands, which is a lot about collective intergenerational trauma and healing. And I encourage anyone who's interested in pursuing this further, obviously looking into different somatic workshops, different trauma-informed practices, but really taking advantage of anytime NYU offers to sponsor or pay for a participation in a program. I feel really grateful that I had this opportunity, and appreciate the chance to get to share a little bit more about what really moved and inspired me here. So thank you all again, and bye for now.